Well, first of all, good morning. It's a pleasure to be here. I think we had already a very nice first day of this seminar yesterday. And today, what I want to do is in some kind of way, I think, very complementary to what the previous speaker did, who was talking to you about the very big territorial scale of Sao Paulo. And I'm going to take you to a very, let's say, architectural scale of the city, you could say. In the conversion of the PowerPoint, there's something a bit wrong with the letter type and in the dimensions of the images, so I excuse for that. But that's the best that we can do at this moment, so you will need to go with that. The reason that I want to talk to you today about the notion of the commons, let's say, is because I'm very interested in a set of shifts that are taking place in our contemporary city. Sorry, I need to... I think that we are experiencing, or that we can detect in the contemporary city, a set of what I would call paradigmatic shifts. A first shift is a shift in initiating, conceiving, developing and maintaining the architecture of the city, where previously the state on the one hand and the market on the other hand were the main drivers of the architecture of the city. I think that we see now different sorts of initiatives emerging. Initiatives that are more co-productive and collaborative, if you want to, and which are composed of complex groups of citizens, of public and private actors. So a new way of initiating the architecture of the city. A second interest of mine in a set of new projects is that I believe that there are a whole set of projects that start to think in a new way about what urban resources are, what resources are as such. A new way of understanding how architecture and urban design engages with common urban resources taking into account material, spatial, natural and social resources. And a third, let's say, field of interest of mine, why I want to speak about the commons, is because I also think that we see a new types of urban spaces emerging in our cities. Urban spaces that we can no longer qualify according to this classical divide of the public and the private, but are something third, something different, let's say. For me, the project here in Sao Paulo of Lina Bobardi is one example of such a new development, I would say. The initiative is taken, of course, by an association of small commercial and entrepreneurs. But what I think is the so-called Serviço Social do Comércio. But what I think is very, very interesting is that what used to be a sort of private space in the city, namely a factory where barrels were made, is through a set of very, very precise architectural interventions turned into a common resource, I would say. These architectural interventions are very simple architectural interventions of opening the site, making gates and access ways to the site. These architectural interventions are about adding very simple and basic elements as fire and water to the site. Or also these very, let's say, rudimentary elements on which you can sit and lie and enjoy. And I think of all of these elements together, they create indeed a new sort of space of appearance. A space of appearance which can't be qualified with the public and the private divide. A space of appearance where you can talk, see, are being perceived as you can see here. Also, this is of course then the first part, as you all know very well, a space of appearance which is also about indeed watching performances taking place. A space of appearance which is also a space of production, but not industrial production, but creative production, as you can see in this part of the project. And then last but not least, I went from left to right, but last but not least, a space of appearance where you also can be in touch with the primary resources, with sun, light, rain, if you want to, as well in this part of the project. So I think in that sense that the project of the CES Pompea of Lina Bobardi is for me one of the forerunners, you could say, of projects that I'm very interested in. And I think that in order to understand what these projects are about and what they mean as a common resource to the city, this is the project of course, what they mean as a common resource to a city as Sao Paulo, that we need new theoretical frames, new ways of looking at these projects and understanding their role and their importance in the city. I would even say that we are at the moment in a state of a sort of what I would call an epistemic eclipse. An epistemic eclipse, and that we are in search indeed for theories and methods to understand what is happening in our cities. I should go to the next slide right now, but that's apparently not working. Yep. Sorry. I've been out of that perspective, I've become myself very interested in what I think is a very, very rich theoretical field, and this is this theoretical field, which is the theoretical field of thinking on the commons. This field of thinking on the commons is a field that was initiated in economic sciences, but very fastly migrated to political sciences. That's what you see at the left. These are all elongated books, but they look a bit square right now, which became very important in social geography, and which are also, let's say, of very big importance in ecological thinking at the moment. So a very, very rich field of theory that indeed, that I believe can help us as architects and urban designers to think in a new way about the city. So what I'm going to do in the remainder of this lecture, I already told you a bit about my interest in the commons. And in the remainder of this lecture, I'm going to take two steps. First, I'm going to tell you about these theories of the commons, a sort of crash course, if you want to, introducing you in what this theoretical frame of the commons might mean. And in the last part of the talk, I will show you how, indeed, new design approaches of the city might emerge from that by bringing you to two case studies in the Netherlands. So that's very simply what I'm going to do. So let's start with the theory of the commons. The theory of the commons, as I already told to you, is a theory which emerged from the field of economics. It was introduced by the lady that you see on the right-hand side, of which you see Elinor Ostrom, which is a Nobel Prize winner of economics, and who started to talk in the late 1980s and the beginning of the 1990s about this notion of the commons. And many people, as you see to the left-hand side, have followed her since then. But what are these commons about? Well, I would like to suggest to you that we can approach these commons from three angles. And these are three angles that I'm suggesting to you, which I call res communis, lex communis, and praxis communis. Three ways of understanding what these commons can be about. My first category of res communis is starting from the very, very basic definitions of what the commons are about. The commons are about common pool resources. Resources that in some kind of way are shared are part of a common pool. And Elinor Ostrom has defined this very, very specifically.
One of the important things is to recognize that things in the world out there have different structure. And it used to be, years ago, we had the notion that there were public goods and private goods. And so you needed government for public goods and you needed the market for private goods. And we introduced a notion that combined a public good is easily available to all within a region, but not subtractive. A common pool resource is also easily available to all in a region, but it's subtractive. The fish I catch, you can't catch.
Well, the fish I catch, you can't catch. I think what is very important to remember from this introduction by the grand lady herself of the commons, let's say, is indeed that this commons is a way to think not about public goods or to think about private goods, but think about the resources that we have in the city in a third way, you could say, where resources are available to all, but they're also subtractable. We can take from that. So and Elinor Ostrom is saying that the term common pool resource is something that can refer both to a man-made system as to a natural system. And that is, I think, interesting for us, thinking about the architecture of the city, that this can be both about common resources that we share, like water, green, natural resources, but can also be about man-made resources, materials, certain spaces even as well. So I think it's in that sense offering us a very strong framework. People that are thinking about the commons, they are saying that, let's say, these resources and the fact that they are kept common, that there is constant under a certain kind of pressure. And here we see a quote from Silke Helfrich, who's saying that the history of capitalism which is driving our cities and the development of our cities in a very strong way, is also a history of enclosure of the commons. It's about enclosing these resources that could be common, enclosing them time and time again. That's what she say is the history of capitalism about. Another big thinker of the common is this man, the Austrian-Hungarian philosopher Ivan Illich. And Illich is pointing to the fact that when we think about common resources, that they are always common for several groups, let's say. He's using the metaphor of the oak tree, and try to read with me. He's saying an oak tree might be in the commons. Its shade in the summer is reserved for the shepherd and his flock. Its acorns are reserved for the pigs of the neighboring peasants. The acorns are the fruits, let's say, of the oak tree. Its dry branches serve as fuel for the widows of the village. Some of its fresh twigs are used in springtime as ornaments for the church. And at sunset, the oak tree becomes the place where the village assembly is taking place. Why I think it's a very, very strong metaphor, let's say, of the oak tree as a commons for different groups of this environment of the village simultaneously. Another, I think, important thinker for us to think about these commons in an urban way is the political scientist Michel Balance. And Michel Balance, he's making a very interesting differentiation between the common resources that we can find in our cities. He's talking about inherited commons, and the inherited commons, this is water, forests, greens, everything which is there that we've inherited by being on the planet, you can say. He's talking about immaterial commons, resources that are there in the city, the knowledge that people have, the crafts that people know as immaterial commons. And he's talking about material commons. And I think for those of us thinking about the city, that's also very important. Indeed, the bricks, the wood, all of the elements that are there in our cities, they can be considered as commons as well. So I think a very, very interesting way of exploring how indeed this idea of common resources can inform our view on the city in a new way. Maybe you think, wow, this sounds all very theoretical, but when we look at the history of our cities, we find many, many instances where commons were present in our cities and in our urban territories. And I'm taking you to one example. This is the example of De Meent in the Netherlands. And we are looking here to the city of Hilversum. The city of Hilversum is a relatively small city close to the city of Amsterdam, to the east of the city of Amsterdam. And in relation to that city, there was a space called De Meent. And De Meent was a very big agricultural area related to these inherited commons, you could say, green fields, fertile fields that played a very important role in maintaining the city, in producing, indeed, also as we saw in the previous lecture, indeed producing the food, of course, for this city as well. But the particular characteristic of this Meent was that it was not privatized, that it didn't belong to single farmers, let's say, but that it belonged to the collective of the city. That it belonged to the collective of the city, and the peasants of the city, they gathered on a yearly basis to decide, to negotiate, you could say, what parts of this land could be used in the next year. So the idea of a piece of an inherited resource, let's say, that wasn't privatized, but that was kept collectively. And then I'm interested in the fact that there were minor architectural elements that were regulating this negotiation. This is a plan of a part of this Meent, and there you see that there is the element of the road, and on the element of fences, who is, in my mind, architectural elements, who are year and year again, let's say, negotiating and regulating how this land was divided amongst the collectivity of domains. Here you see an image of that. But when we look in the history of architecture, we see many, many instances where architecture becomes a sort of regulator of natural resources. This is another instance, an example from France, the so-called lavoir, which is indeed a sort of architecture which regulates the natural resource of water for the city. You can find lavoirs in small towns and villages. That's what you see here, where the lavoir is a very, very simple architectural structure which unlocks this natural resource for use, for washing and for bathing in this case. But when we look in the history of architecture, we see that these lavoirs, they become very important structures within towns and cities as well, and indeed regulating not only the use of the water, but also regulating the social life, you could say, in the cities as well. This is one of the most elaborate ones. This is the lavoir de la Fosse d'Yonne in Tonnerre, the south of France, where indeed a very, very elaborate architecture is let's say, thought of in order to regulate, on the one hand, fresh water that enters the city, and on the other hand, water that can be used for washing and for doing other things. So architecture as a regulator of these resources which are kept in common and which are regulated by this architecture. So this was my first category. When we think about the commons, we should think about the commons as a res communis, as common pool resources which are there in our cities and which are natural resources like water, like green, let's say, but which are also immaterial and material resources, as Bouwens was learning us. The next element that I would like to talk about is the element of what I called lex communis. And the lex communis, this is really about the codes and conventions that are related to resources. This is, for people like Elinor Ostrom, it's a very, very important issue, let's say. When we think about common resources, we need codes and conventions, rules, in order to protect these resources. Resources are not endless. They have a certain limit to them, and we need certain codes and conventions to protect these resources. In the theories of the commons, there's a very well-known perspective, and that's called the tragedy of the commons. And please try to look at the cartoon at the right-hand side. There you see a commons, an agricultural land, where there are indeed cows grazing, let's say, a few farmers using this common land, and then more and more farmers detecting this common resource, and that's then the end of the resource. The resource is exhausted, the resource is empty, you could say. So that's why you need codes and conventions. Maybe you think, wow, this is a bit of an abstract example from an agricultural land, but we have in our cities, we also have these kind of examples. This is, for instance, one of them that I'm sure you all know very well. I'm sure that you all know that this is the website of Airbnb, of course. Well, Airbnb started as an idea of a common resource. I have an extra room, and somebody else in another city also has an extra room, and we're going to, let's say, swap these rooms. There's a way of sharing these resources, of making them common, let's say. That's how our Airbnb started. This idea, people meeting one another, sharing in cities these extra rooms, let's say. But we all know that what happened is that these common resources, they got commodified. And that's what, for instance, one of my colleagues in the Netherlands was showing, that when we look at the city of Amsterdam, for instance, and we look at the facades, actually all of these houses, they have now these commodified collective resources, let's say. If you look at the map of Amsterdam and you look at all of the orange dots are these Airbnb rooms, these commodified resources, and the blue ones are the official hotel rooms. So in cities like Amsterdam, but the same goes for Paris, for New York, and for London, indeed, these resources, or the system of collective resources, of common pool resources, now have been enormously commodified, and this creates, of course, enormous problems. This is still from a movie where indeed this guy is living there permanently, in his house permanently, and these people, they are changing every 2-3 days because the common pool resource became commodified, and this is creating, of course, enormous problems. So indeed, when we think about the commons, we need principles, we need rules, we need codes and conventions, let's say. And Elinor Ostrom is giving a very, very nice example of how architecture can play a role in defining these codes and conventions. She's talking about the Huerta system in Spain, in the region of Valencia. And in this area, this was a very, very arid area, a very dry area. We're talking about this region here. A very interesting system of sharing a resource. The resource of water was developed. A system where you see that there was one river, the original river was here, and a set of canals was developed in order to share this common resource. A set of big canals and of smaller canals going upon very, very fine-grained canals, let's say, and turning in this area from an arid area, from a very dry area, into a very fertile and green area, where indeed, thanks to this sharing of this common pool resource, let's say. But again, architecture was very, very instrumental in setting the codes and the conventions to use this resource. In what way? Well, in 2 ways. First of all, there was an architecture created where the use of this resource can be negotiated. In front of the Cathedral of Valencia, there is indeed this place where the leaders of the Huertas, they gather and they negotiate, let's say, how this resource can be used. That's only one, because more importantly, the canals were indeed the architecture of the canals is suggesting a way of using this water. The way that the canals are constructed, the various locks, the various ways of leading the water. So the very architecture of the canals, I would say, is suggesting, is in some kind of way installing a set of codes and conventions of how this collective resource can be used. It's a bit of a jump, but I really believe that it is true. If you look at this very, very elaborate system, you see that in the system, in the infrastructure, let's say, there's a set of codes and conventions embedded in it. At some points in history, architects and urban designers have been thinking about the architecture of the city through this lens of codes and conventions. And this is, I think, a very nice example from France. This is the so-called Pont et Chaussée administration. And this Pont et Chaussée administration was an administration that designed most of the public works in France, from the bridges to the roads, to some of the lavoirs that I've been showing to you before as well. But the interesting thing is that these Pont et Chaussée, they were not designing full roads or full bridges or full lavoirs, but they were designing a set of people like Alphand, for instance. They were designing a set of codes and conventions. That's literally what they were designing. They were designing a set of urban elements, benches, fountains, trees. They were designing profiles, let's say, how to combine these elements, but they were never designing the full element, let's say, or the full street. So only defining a set of codes and conventions as a way of designing the architecture of the city, I would say. So that's what you see here. They did that for open spaces, but another very well-known example is by this man, by Louis Bruyère, who indeed did that for market spaces as well, for covered defined market spaces, designing a set of principles and codes and conventions, and indeed implementing these in very different locations in a city like Paris with well-known, with these kind of well-known results, you could say. So when we think about the commons being indeed on the one hand about common pool resources, that's the first thing that I talked about. The commons being about a set of common codes and conventions to think about the architecture of the city. And the last part that I want to talk about is the idea that the commons are also about common practices, let's say, doing things together. This is most probably the most well-known part when we think about the commons. It's about what Richard Sennett has called the pleasures, politics, and rituals of commoning, of doing things together. So indeed, these social practices, as people like David Bollier are saying, it's about patterns of commoning, of doing things together, as indeed an alternative to state and market. So what we see more and more in these theories of the commons is that people say, well, instead of waiting that the city is produced by the state or by the market, we are taking, as groups of people, we are taking initiatives, as it were. But I also want to point out that this idea of taking initiative together, that this has a very long historical pedigree. One of the pedigrees that I can think about is this pedigree. This is the work of Patrick Geddes, who was working in the city of Edinburgh, and who was indeed already around 1900 trying to understand the city through cooperative knowledge, through knowledge that was generated through the collective, let's say. Geddes was indeed trying to understand the city of Edinburgh, which was around 1900, a very industrialized and dilapidated city. And he was doing that not as a sort of expert sitting in his office and trying to draw the map of Edinburgh, but by tapping into the knowledge that the collective of citizens of Edinburgh had at their disposal. So what he was literally doing was going with people into the city, that's the idea of the civic survey, and mapping the city and understanding the city from a citizen's perspective. And that's the sort of maps that they made. They were looking at spaces that as a normal urban architect or urban planner, you wouldn't recognize as valuable spaces. Spaces that were a bit leftover spaces, at these kind of spaces, or spaces that were in the back of housing blocks, as you see here. But identifying them as spaces with a very, very big potential for the everyday life of people in the city of Edinburgh. And then drawing these kind of maps where they defined in the very city center of Edinburgh, this is the castle, in the very city center of Edinburgh, more than 70 spots on which they could intervene. Not relying on the knowledge of the expert, but relying on the knowledge of the collective, let's say, in the city of Edinburgh. And then subsequently thinking about projects to unlock these spaces. And the projects were very, very simple, let's say. They were about creating a stair, as you can see here. Sometimes it was very, very simply about creating a stair to these resources, sometimes a bit more elaborate. And the result were indeed spaces that could be used by the children of the neighborhood, by the inhabitants of the neighborhood for leisurely use, as you can see here, a garden that you can just sort of, a collective garden that you can leisurely use, but also, and here you see the existing condition and then what they planned. So for leisurely use, but also for more productive, to create small productive landscapes, you could say, within the city of Edinburgh as well. This idea of tapping into, of collectively doing something is something that Geddes was doing around 1900, but was also something that Renzo Piano was doing around at the end of the 1970s, when Renzo Piano was asked to renovate these kind of towns in the south of Italy. This was a UNESCO commission. The normal way of approaching this commission would be that Renzo Piano, as an expert, would say, okay, I will renovate this town, and I will get some big constructors in to renovate this town. But what they try to do in this project is, again, to tap into the collective knowledge, the cooperative dimension, let's say, of these towns, relying on the knowledge that was there with the citizens, on the historical knowledge that was there with the citizens, relying on the craftsmanship that was there in these towns and using that. And how were they doing that? Well, they were doing that by starting what they call laboratoria dei quartieri, laboratories of the neighborhood, let's say. And these laboratories of the neighborhood, they were all about this collaborative aspect. Collaborative aspect to renovate these cities. So these laboratories was literally a sort of pavilion, which was landed in the midst of these towns. Here you see the pavilion, set up with the help already of the citizens. But the important thing was that these laboratories, they had different sections. A first section was the section Formazione and Informazione, where it was about sharing knowledge with the inhabitants. How can we indeed form and inform one another? And this can be done through the exhibition, this can be done through this sort of dialogue between the architects and the inhabitants, let's say. A second sector, let's say, of this project was the so-called sector, the Diagnostic Sector, which was a sector where citizens were learned to analyze and to understand their own built environment. So they were given certain tools, they were given certain methods, let's say, to analyze their environment. A third sector was the sector of co-design, designing together. So this is not about analyzing together or dialoguing together, but this is designing together. And the last sector was really about co-building, building together as a way to define a project for the city. And that's what also happened. Indeed, some of these towns, they were literally constructed according to these more, let's say, collective practices and the different ways of understanding these collective practices. So what I did until right now is that I really showed to you that indeed when we think about these commons, that these commons, they point us to three interrelated fields, you can say. To the field of thinking about the common resources that we have in our cities, to the field of thinking about the common codes and conventions that we have in our cities, and to the field of the common practices that we find in our cities, all contributing to a new way of developing the architecture of the city. And in the last part of my lecture, I would just like to show two projects that in my mind are using these strategies, are indeed thinking about this res communis, this lex communis, and this praxis communis in order to intervene in the city. The first project that I want to take you to is a project in the city of Amsterdam. And this is the project of De Keuvel, a project that was located in the industrial part of Amsterdam, the so-called Amsterdam North. And we are talking about this site, a site in the harbor of Amsterdam. It was a very polluted site, an industrial site, which was very polluted. And in 2008, this site could no longer be developed according to the normal developmental logics of Amsterdam, namely asking the market to develop this site. So the city of Amsterdam had to find another way of developing this. And what did they do? They announced a competition, and they asked indeed for another way of developing this site. And the winners of this competition was a very, very complex group of people, including architects, landscape architects, citizens associations, artists, all working together to try to define a new sort of project for the city, I would say. And this new sort of project for the city, indeed, this is the derelict site. This is the old Amsterdam here. That's a part of the old Amsterdam. This is the River Ij, and this is the site that we are talking about. And this new sort of project started from a very, very different understanding of what sort of resources do we have available. This was a polluted site. In normal developmental logics, this was not a resource, this was a burden, let's say. But what these people were saying is that this site could be looked upon as a resource as long as you define a very, very special project for that. So what did they say? This polluted site is a resource, and we can indeed, let's say, work with this resource, transform this resource through a very smart landscape project. So what they did is that they said, okay, we are going to planned this site, this polluted site, and not as normally was done when a polluted site is turned into a non-polluted site. You would have a time dimension of a few months. I mean, this would be chemical processes, let's say, that were followed. They were saying we take a time horizon of 10 years, and within these 10 years, this new landscape will depollute the sites, let's say. So that was their idea. I'm not a specialist in landscape architecture, but well, these are the different plans that they were using. And then they said, but we also need a new way of inhabiting the site, of allotting the site, you could say. And they found another resource in Amsterdam, and these are these so-called dwelling boats. It's a very important resource in Amsterdam. Many people are living on these boats, and they said, why don't we use these dwelling boats as a way of inhabiting this site? And that's what they planned. The boats will be on the site and will form a new sort of allotment, let's say, where the creative classes, artists will work and live, let's say, and there will also be some collective functions added to that. And after 10 years, these boats, they can go away, and the site can be rethought, reconceived, let's say. So for me, this is a sort of project which you could only think about when you think of this site as a resource in the long run, let's say. So it's a different way of thinking about this resource, not as something that we can build upon within a year, but something that might become available, let's say, in a time span of 10 years and is a common resource. So this is also what happened. The site was developed. Here you see the site with the different boats. Here you see that in order to be able to use the site, there was also a boardwalk system developed, which indeed allowed to enter the boats, because remember, the site was very, very polluted. You couldn't literally stand on the ground. That's how polluted these were. There was a whole, let's say, system developed for upgrading the boats. I won't talk about that right now. But the main message that I want to get across is that indeed this site, which was seen as a burden, was now turned into, I would say, a common resource. A common resource for the people living and working there. That's what you see here. But also a common resource which very soon became a common resource for the whole neighborhood of Amsterdam North, and even for the larger community of Amsterdam, which now recognized this site, I think much like some of the CESCs here in Sao Paulo, as really a site where you can, where you can thrive as a new sort of centrality, you could say, in Amsterdam as well. So this is for me one example in which indeed res communis, the identification of these common resources, by the way also the water of course, which was next to the site, as identifying that as a common resource, but then also the praxis communis played a very important role in establishing a new, what I would call a new sort of project for the city. I mean, admittedly, a project which is a sort of laboratory project, but I think nevertheless a new sort of project. The last project that I want to talk about is a project where I'm going to take you not to the city of Amsterdam, but to the middle of the other big city in the Netherlands, the middle of the city of Rotterdam, really the center of the city of Rotterdam. And we are looking here at this, we are mainly looking at this location. For those of you who know the city of Rotterdam, this is the main station of the city of Rotterdam. So this is what in developers' terms calls a sort of prime A location, a very important location. And until 2008, there were big plans to turn all of this site into a site with big offices, 3 casinos, 2 hotels. That were the plans for this site. And then, indeed, the crisis of 2008 hit. And also the city of Rotterdam didn't know very well how to develop this site, and they had the same sort of reflex as the city of Amsterdam. They opened a competition, let's say, and again, a very interesting collaborative of actors took the initiative here. Actors, again, that were architects' offices, landscape architects, were citizens associations, neighborhood associations, coming together and trying to formulate an alternative project for this site. And this alternative project, this is the plan. Previously, we were standing here with the camera and we were looking in this direction. This is the main station of Rotterdam, and we are talking about this block. That's where it all started, let's say. And what they did is they followed, in my mind, very clearly the categories that I've explaining to you. The first thing that they did is that they established a sort of lex communis. And this lex communis was a path and a color, I would say. The color was yellow, as you can see. That was, let's say, the joint color. And the path was connecting the main central station to this block that was there. So this is the path in its first, let's say, moment. And the path was bit by bit extended in the city of Rotterdam. So very simply, how do we start a project for the city? We start the project for the city by setting up a set of codes and conventions. And the codes and conventions are a path and are a color, let's say. And from that path and that color, the project for the city can develop. So here you see the path was very simply painted on the street or on the walkway, as you see here, or paint on a part of a parking lot that they identified as this path. And then maybe becoming in the end a bit more elaborate, the path became indeed a stair and a bridge in the next phases of the project. So a color and a path, let's say, as one way to think about a project for the city, and indeed dealing with this lex communis, defining the lex communis as a first, let's say, step in defining a project for the city. Secondly, I think what they did is that when they went on with the project, that bit by bit, they identified new common resources for the city. And they unlocked common resources for the city. One of the first common resources for the city that they unlocked was this passage, you could say. A passage which was previously in a private building, but which was now discovered, or you could say reclaimed, as indeed a common resource. A resource that all citizens can use as a passageway in the city. That's what you see here. But very, very important to link this block, this housing, this block of housing and offices indeed, to the main station of the city of Rotterdam. So that's what you see from the other side. Here you see it maybe a bit clearer. This is the train station of Rotterdam. This is the passageway. And you see that this was, of course, a prime element in order to create this connection to this station. Sometimes the resources were also about understanding that part of a parking lot could be turned into a public walkway, let's say, as you see here. Sometimes it was also about understanding that in a private block, as this block that we see in the back of the image, that by making a stair and using the hallway of that block, you could make another passageway, another sort of passage through the block. A very important passageway. Down under you need to imagine that the main station of Rotterdam is. This is the passageway through the block, and this is of course connecting this now to the other side of the city. Huh? So and being extended in this way. But also discovering as they go that the common resources were not only these private places that could be reclaimed, but also understanding that next to the railroad there were all kinds of spaces which were unused, which were just there, sort of derelict spaces, which could be turned into common resources as well. So that's what they did. They started to turn some of these spaces, which were previously just garbage spaces, into spaces that could be used by the citizens of Rotterdam. And so that's what you see here. They were turning this into a park, let's say. So this whole space, which was previously a sort of non-space, was turned into a park. And the moment that they did this, they discovered that at the other side of the railroads, there was another sort of structure that could be reclaimed as a common resource, which was an old station. This was, now we are here, we started here. This was made, this is this passageway, this is the park, and now they discovered that they could make this relation, because there was an old station, as you can see, an old station that was no longer used, so this was just a sort of open deck, if you want to, and they said, well, we can reclaim that as a common area as well, a common area which is not just for passing through, but which is an area where leisurely and sportive activities can take place for the neighborhood. So that's what you see here, and here some of these leisurely activities, even a cinema screening at summer nights taking place. So indeed, bit by bit, as this Luchtsingel unfolded, they were discovering several areas of the city which were forgotten, let's say, and which could be reclaimed as common resources. A last resource that I wanted to talk about is that they discovered that some of the roofs of the buildings, they could also be reclaimed as common resources, and they could be turned into, if you want, to agricultural land, this urban farming, of course, and that's what also happened. So in the very city center of Rotterdam, in this prime A location, now there was a collective garden for the people of this neighborhood, as you can see here. Last but not least, this project is also an example of my notion of praxis communis. This project was not a project which was initiated only by the state or only by the market. This project was a project which was driven through other logics, you could say, collective logics, or common logics, I would say in this sense. A first logic which was very important for this project is that part of the project was let's say, the different steps of the project were indeed celebrated by common activities, as you can see here. Every time when a little part of this project, of this long part was realized, there were all kinds of parties, events, discussions, thinking about, okay, what the future of this project would be. That's what you see here. But the project was also about co-building, co-constructing, let's say. Normally, this is a diagram of the park, the little park that I showed you next to the railway. Normally, what would happen in the Netherlands, if you would construct a park, the city would call a big landscape firm that would come this landscape, would construct this landscape, but they didn't choose to do that here. Here they relied upon the capacities of citizens, the citizens of Rotterdam, to construct this park. And you should read this as dates. This is the 30th of May, the 31st of May, the 1st of June, the 2nd of June, the 3rd of June, and so on. And so this park was constructed with the capacities, the knowledge of the citizens, let's say. So here you see the park in some of its initial phases. You see that the park was organized according to a very, let's say, specific grid. And here you see how indeed this park was bit by bit constructed by all of these citizens that you see here in this image, and indeed became a full-fledged park, not realized by the market, by a market party, but realized by the citizens as such. I think that this is the last image that I wanted to show to you today, because I think that this image shows that the projects that I've been talking about, they are of course small projects, you could say. I mean, this is a way of thinking about a city which was exemplified in two very small projects. One project in Amsterdam, the other one in Rotterdam. But I do hope that you can see from an image like this one that these were projects that had a very, very big effect on the city. So although they were small, although they started from this idea of the commons, let's say, their effect was enormous. And that makes me believe that this thinking about the commons taught us res communis on the one hand, as common resources that we can discover and can reclaim in the city, taught as lex communis, as the codes and conventions through which we want to build our cities, and taught as praxis communis, that this thinking of the commons indeed might point us to another way of thinking about the architecture of the city. Another way of thinking about the architecture of the city that was exemplified in these two projects, but that in my mind has a resonance and an importance that reaches far beyond these two projects in the Netherlands. Thanks.
Bom, tenho a difícil tarefa de encerrar, simplesmente, porque a gente está com a agenda, com o cronograma bastante atrasado e a gente tem uma questão do almoço já planejada, então eu vou fazer só um breve comentário e vou pedir para as pessoas que tiverem questões que encaminhem e que coloquem o e-mail, que depois nós vamos organizar como nós vamos resolver essa questão, tá? Questões sobre a fala do Tom podem ser encaminhadas, só coloquem um e-mail para a gente poder organizar. Eu quero agradecer muito ao Tom, acho que foi uma uma fala muito inspiradora e ela representa um pouco a síntese das nossas questões, as questões que envolvem o seminário inteiro, né? Primeiro, a identificação. Okay? A identificação de novas práticas espaciais que necessitam uma reflexão conceitual e teórica sobre elas, né? Então, ao mesmo tempo, a gente identifica novos processos de construção e de produção de espaço, mas eles precisam uma reflexão, né? Então, a partir de novas premissas sobre o projeto, a gente vai ter que encaminhar novas maneiras de pensar o que é o design, o que é a arquitetura, qual a intervenção urbana. Isso é um grande campo para a nossa atividade, para pensar novas formas que são resultado de um novo olhar sobre a sociedade. Eu queria fazer só, rapidamente, uma pergunta para o Tom, eu quero ouvi-lo um pouco mais, porque a identificação do commons, ainda que seja, na minha perspectiva, uma estrutura histórica da interação social, ou seja, o commons é praticamente uma das formas de interação que criam a própria civilização, o próprio homem na história, né? E essa grande estrutura ela adquire na história formas muito distintas, né? Ele se expressa de formas muito distintas e apesar de todo o desenvolvimento dos últimos séculos, essa estrutura não foi eliminada das relações sociais e, mais do que isso, ela é identificada no momento em que exatamente a ideia de commons está sendo, né, capturada por, pelo menos, as outras duas grandes forças que fazem da produção do espaço e da vida, que é a racionalidade necessária, por exemplo, para pensar em infraestrutura, normalmente associada ao Estado, etc., né, e a inevitável valorização desses espaços, que passa a ser um objeto de interesse do capital privado, dos investimentos. Então, o commons, desde o século XVIII, pelo menos, ele tem um momento de grande expressão. Ele é capturado pelo Estado no sentido amplo. O Estado é o commons na Revolução Burguesa. E, no mundo contemporâneo, o capital é o commons, né? Mas, no entanto, como eu disse ontem, né, ele existe, porque são formas de interação social que só podem ser extinguidas com a extinção mesmo das próprias relações sociais. Então, como ele vê nesse processo de avanço dos investimentos privados sobre quase todos os aspectos da vida, né? Inclusive e principalmente até a cultura como também um grande commons, né? Como ele vê esse processo, se a gente vai tratar só de exceções ou se isso pode constituir um processo mais abrangente de transformação das relações urbanas, né? E também eu gostaria que ele comentasse, que é importante para nós, o fato de os exemplos que o commons tem uma questão relativa à comunidade, a uma certa imediaticidade, uma espontaneidade que, no entanto, na complexificação do mundo contemporâneo, que envolve questões complexas de infraestrutura, de racionalização, de áreas metropolitanas bastante complexas, o commons só existe se uma parte dele for pensada e articulada através do projeto. Nos exemplos que você mostrou, eu acho que a questão do que a arquitetura tem a dizer sobre essas novas formas de ocupação do espaço, acho que é bastante importante. Então, eu gostaria que você falasse rapidamente, se possível, sobre como você vê a participação da arquitetura nesse novo processo, né? O que a gente tem que abandonar como forma histórica de expressão do espaço ilustrado, do espaço, né, erudito, e como a gente deve caminhar sem desaparecer em direção às práticas e aos usos criativos que são próprios dos usuários e não dos arquitetos.
Well, thank you, thank you, Luis. I mean, I think you ask many questions and also, well, big questions, of course. For me, let's say the interest in the commons emerges from, let's say, looking at the architecture of the city as something which used to be, particularly in the European context, driven by the state, the welfare state, for instance, who was indeed a very, very important actor in developing our cities. But of course, we know that at, let's say, the end of the 20th century, the state has been, the agency of the state has been diminishing, let's say, and indeed the agency has been given to the market, the neoliberal system that we all know too well. But I think what is interesting about the notion of the commons, that the notion of the commons is beyond state and market. But beyond state and market doesn't necessarily mean that state and market, they don't have any role to play any longer. For instance, I still believe that the state, even a weakened state, in some of the projects that I showed in the Netherlands, the two last projects that I showed in the Netherlands, the state played a role, but a very different role than it normally played, where it was the sole agent, let's say, when we look at the welfare state. Now the state becomes one of the many players, and a citizens association is, let's say, as powerful, I would say, as the state. That's a sort of, let's say, new assemblage of actors that I see, let's say, joining forces, as it were. And even the market can have a role in that, but it's a role controlled, let's say, or contracted by these other actors. That's for me a very important aspect. What I try to do, and this is of course all very rapidly because this is part of a much bigger project, is that I think that I try to show that both in thinking about what are the common resources in our cities, as what are the common codes and conventions that we use to develop our cities, and what are still the common codes and conventions that we hold to develop our cities, as in terms of the common practices. I think that all of these issues, they are issues to architects. Let's say. And they also, in my mind, and that's the second part of your question, they also require that we rethink what a project is. What is a project for the city? Well, in my mind, a project for the city needs to understand that there are multiple agencies, let's say, that indeed the city is a good city, I would say, is until a large extent co-produced, I would say, meaning including or taking into account the agency of citizens and the immediacy that has. I mean, taking that into account as well. So I think that on all of these levels, so thinking about what are the common resources that we want to keep accessible, thinking about what are the common codes and conventions that we use in our cities. Are there still any common codes and conventions beyond, let's say, that a building needs to give a certain financial return? Are there other codes and conventions that collectively we want to uphold, let's say? I think these are the questions that we need to ask right now in order to, well, yeah, at least try to formulate, I would say, an alternative for the neoliberal regime that is steering and driving our cities at this moment. So I think that's where, in my mind, the challenges are located. There are many aspects to this. For instance, one of the things that is very important, that is when you look at the fact that the city is co-produced, let's say, that different actors in the city, they think about different temporalities of the city. Maybe a citizens association, they are thinking about the now and the here of the city. In principle, a state or an urban designer or an architect should maybe take into account a much longer temporal dimension. So there are, of course, many aspects that follow from this. But I do think that there is something powerful, let's say, in this theoretical frame. In order to think about our cities in a new way, also in order to come up with let's say, a sort of alternative for all of the resources that get privatized in our cities. I mean, or indeed that are only, let's say, the prerequisite of very small groups, those who are living in the condominium, those who are living in the gated community. I think that we need to move beyond that. And in that sense, I've been always very, very interested in initiatives like this one, because I think they are really, in that sense, exemplary. How indeed what I would call a common actor, I mean, the CESC, can indeed, let's say, give the city new impulses, let's say, new programmatic impulses. But then when I'm looking at the CESC Pompeii, I think it's also adding a new sort of spaces that I tried to illustrate in the very beginning, spaces of public appearance, which are not the spaces of the state, nor the spaces of the private club, let's say, to which you need to pay an entrance fee or a membership, but something different. And I think that that's really the path where we need to go. So I strongly believe in the kind of actors like the CESC to propel our cities forward, let's say. I also see that, for instance, what is happening in the Netherlands, these projects are, I mean, I know, of course, they're very, very small projects. They're projects that are, I mean, they're almost like artistic, funny little projects, you could say. Maybe even more so the Keuvel than the one in Rotterdam, the Luchtsingel. The Luchtsingel is a bit bigger, but I do think that they change, let's say, the mind of people. And you were saying at a certain point, yeah, but this is about society. And I think, in my mind, in many, many levels in society, we are thinking about commons nowadays. We are thinking about a sharing economy. And I think we as architects and as urban designers should also tap into that. So that's a bit my project, that I believe that indeed, in thinking about the architecture of the city, we can tap into this new sort of, let's say, understanding that seems to emerge. I mean, in my generation in Europe, I mean, it was still very important, and when we were 18 years old, that you owned a car, let's say, the car that was really, let's say, a status symbol. What I see nowadays is that students, they don't, this question of ownership is completely differently perceived, let's say. And that's also what the commons is about. I mean, what can we consider as common resources in our cities? And what needs to be, and what can I use as an individual, let's say, but that's the main question that I think that we have in front of us, to ask that question again, not in the fashion that the welfare state was asking that question, because we are not living in welfare state conditions any longer. We're living in different conditions, but there is something in society, I think, happening, which can also help us to think in a different way about the architecture of the city.
Well, thank you. Very nice. Obrigado. Observações muito importantes, acho que para o nosso debate, para o nosso seminário, que vão continuar com certeza, porque acho que é disso que se trata.